Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that explain why this war will not end the way anyone in Washington or Tel Aviv originally planned, and the gap between them is not a battlefield calculation or a diplomatic miscalculation. It is an economic equation that makes defense mathematically unsustainable. Number one, 10 to 20. That is how many missiles Iran needs to fire per day to sustain this war indefinitely, to keep Israeli civilians in bomb shelters around the clock, to deplete air defense stockpiles faster than they can be resupplied, and to force the economy into a defensive posture that cannot function normally. Number two, 3 to 5. That is how many interceptor missiles Israel must fire at each incoming Iranian projectile to achieve a statistically acceptable probability of a successful intercept. 10 Iranian missiles per day require 30 to 50 Israeli interceptors per day at minimum. And Iran can manufacture those 10 missiles faster and cheaper than Israel can replace those 50 interceptors. Let that sink in for a moment. The war is not being fought on the question of who has superior technology or better trained forces. It is being fought on the question of who runs out of ammunition first, while the other side is still firing. Stay with me, because the insurance market just confirmed what the Pentagon will not publicly admit. The cost to insure a tanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz has increased from $250,000 to $12 million. Not gradually, in one repricing cycle. A $100 million vessel now costs 12% of its value just to insure for a single passage through a choke point that 1/5 of the world's oil must transit to reach global markets. That is not a risk premium. That is the insurance industry telling ship operators that the probability of loss has reached levels where coverage at any rational price is impossible. Underwriters are not making political statements. They are calculating actuarial risk based on real data, and that data shows that the threat environment has fundamentally changed. When a single passage costs $12 million to insure, the economic model for Gulf energy exports collapses. The tanker operators cannot pass that cost to buyers. The buyers cannot absorb it into market prices without triggering demand destruction. And when insurance becomes unaffordable, shipping stops. When shipping stops, energy stops moving. And when energy stops moving, the price of everything that depends on it begins to climb in ways that no central bank intervention or strategic reserve release can contain for more than a few weeks. Oil is now trading above $90 per barrel. Natural gas prices in Europe have spiked 50%. These are not speculative movements. These are supply disruptions being priced into markets that have no alternative sources to fill the gap. The refineries in southern Tehran that the United States and Israel struck are producing black rain across the region as fires burn through facilities that will take years to rebuild. Iran retaliated by striking refineries in Haifa, industrial facilities, naval bases, and Tel Aviv. And then Iran announced that it will increase the rate of its strikes by 100% in the coming period. Not maintain, increase. The strategy is not to create maximum destruction in the shortest time. The strategy is to create sustained attrition that forces a ceasefire, because the defender cannot sustain the economic and logistical burden of intercepting attacks that cost 1/10 as much to launch as they do to stop. Now here's where the American and Israeli strategy reveals its long-term calculation. The targets are not nuclear facilities or missile production plants. The targets are economic infrastructure, refineries, power generation, water treatment, hospitals, schools, grain processing facilities. The objective is not to eliminate Iran's capacity to produce missiles, because that capacity is knowledge-based and can be reconstituted anywhere with the right materials and expertise. The objective is to ensure that whatever government comes to power after this war, whether it is the current regime or a successor, will spend the next 20 years rebuilding the country instead of projecting power regionally. This is not regime change, this is regime bankruptcy. Force the state into a reconstruction cycle so expensive and so prolonged that external aggression becomes economically impossible, regardless of who is governing. But the operational reality is that Iran's missile capacity was never as vulnerable as the initial strike assessments suggested. The missiles are launched from underground silos that can be activated and fired within 5 minutes. They use solid fuel, which means no extended fueling sequence that creates a detectable signature, and they are being fired continuously despite repeated claims that Iran's launch capacity has been destroyed. The intelligence that allowed the initial strikes to target known facilities did not account for the distributed nature of Iran's production and storage infrastructure. Destroying visible sites does not eliminate hidden capacity. The missiles themselves are traveling at hypersonic speeds, Mach 15 to Mach 19, which means they enter Israeli airspace without slowing down due to atmospheric pressure. At those velocities, the kinetic energy alone is sufficient to cause massive damage, even without the explosive payload detonating properly. The gap between the warning siren and the impact is often measured in seconds, not minutes, because the defensive systems have almost no time to calculate intercept solutions for targets moving that fast at that altitude. The radar tracks the launch. The trajectory is calculated. But by the time the interceptor is fired and reaches intercept altitude, the incoming missile has already covered most of the distance, and the engagement window is closed. And then there are the K-bar-Shekin cluster munitions. These are ballistic missiles carrying between 550 kilograms and 1,800 kilograms of explosive payload that open in space and disperse across a wide area. Each missile releases 25 to 80 submunitions, each containing between half a kilogram and 1 kilogram of explosive. If the cluster munition is not intercepted in space, it becomes impossible to stop in the atmosphere, because the defensive systems cannot engage dozens of individual submunitions simultaneously across a dispersed impact zone. This is the saturation problem at the munition level. Even if the primary missile is detected, even if interceptors are launched, the geometry of cluster dispersion creates targeting solutions that exceed the capacity of point defense systems to prosecute. Now consider what this means for the United States military presence in the region. Satellite imagery shows that American bases have been extensively damaged or rendered inoperative. U.S. personnel stationed in Gulf cities, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, are being tracked by Iranian intelligence. That fact alone demonstrates that the United States cannot protect its own forces or its allies in the region to the standard that was promised when those defense contracts were signed and those basing agreements were negotiated. The air defense systems sold to Gulf states were not designed for prolonged attrition warfare or advanced drone saturation attacks. The confusion and system overload has already produced catastrophic friendly fire incidents. Kuwait just shot down 3 of its own F-15 fighter jets because the air defense network could not distinguish between incoming threats and friendly aircraft operating in the same airspace. And here is the vulnerability that should terrify every government from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi. The Gulf states obtain 95 to 100% of their fresh water from desalination plants. Every single one of those plants is within range of Iranian missiles. A sustained campaign against desalination infrastructure would render the Gulf states uninhabitable within weeks. Not strategically compromised, uninhabitable. The population cannot survive without water, and the water supply is entirely dependent on facilities that are fixed, visible, and vulnerable to the exact type of precision strike that Iran has been demonstrating continuously. These are not hardened military targets. These are civilian infrastructure facilities with minimal defensive protection. The economic cost of protecting them with air defense systems exceeds their economic value. That is not a military threat. That is an existential threat that cannot be defended against using interceptor missiles, because the cost to attack is always lower than the cost to defend, and the attacker can choose the timing, while the defender must maintain readiness indefinitely. One successful strike against a major desalination plant creates a water crisis that forces immediate evacuation or capitulation. Now shift to the Lebanese front, because what is happening there reveals that this war was planned long before the initial strikes were launched. Israel prepositioned 100,000 to 110,000 reserve soldiers, logistical support, and ammunition along the Lebanese border months before the conflict escalated. That level of mobilization does not happen in response to an emerging crisis. That level of mobilization is the preparation for a planned operation. And when the Lebanese government declared Hezbollah illegal and issued arrest warrants for its members, and when Israel violated the previous ceasefire agreement, UN Security Council Resolution 1701 15,000 times while killing 500 Lebanese civilians, Hezbollah interpreted that as an existential threat that required a military response. Now Israeli air power is divided between Iran and Lebanon, which creates a strategic opportunity for Hezbollah to defend southern Lebanon and conduct counterattacks without facing the full weight of Israeli air superiority. And there are discussions inside the U.S. administration about a ground operation using Iraqi Kurdish forces rather than a full-scale invasion. But the geography makes that strategy impossible to execute. Iran covers 1,640,000 square kilometers. The Kurdish region that would serve as the operational base covers 28,000 square kilometers. That is less than 2% of the territory. And Iran has already threatened to destroy Erbil and Sulaymaniyah if such an operation is attempted. That threat is credible because the infrastructure exists, the missiles are operational, and the consequences would include the collapse of Kurdish oil infrastructure and the end of Kurdistan's autonomy under the Baghdad government. No Kurdish leadership will cooperate with an operation that results in the destruction of the region they govern. Here is what makes Iran's governance structure uniquely resilient to decapitation strikes. The system is horizontal, not vertical. When senior leaders are killed, the government does not collapse into a succession crisis. The Constitution mandates that the Assembly of Experts, an 88-member body, immediately convenes to select and confirm a new leader. Replacement appointments for critical military positions are pre-planned months in advance. When the large-scale assassinations occurred, the retaliatory strike plans were already on the table and were activated within seconds. Tel Aviv and American bases were hit simultaneously, demonstrating that there was no disruption in command authority. no delay in decision-making, and no operational hesitation. That reaction speed proves that the command structure has not been compromised and that the war can be sustained indefinitely regardless of individual casualties at the leadership level. So here is the full picture. Iran fires 10 to 20 missiles per day, forcing Israel to expend 30 to 50 interceptors per day, while insurance costs for Hormuz transit have increased from $250,000 to $12 million. Oil is trading above $90. European gas prices are up 50%. American bases are extensively damaged. Gulf state air defenses just shot down 3 of their own jets. Desalination plants that provide 100% of the region's fresh water are within missile range. Israel has 110,000 troops on the Lebanese border for an operation that was planned months in advance. U.S. ground invasion plans rely on a Kurdish region that covers less than 2% of Iranian territory. And Iran's governance structure has demonstrated that assassinating leaders does not disrupt operations, because replacements are pre-positioned and retaliatory plans are pre-approved and executed within seconds of a decapitation strike. The American and Israeli strategy is to bankrupt Iran by destroying economic infrastructure and forcing 20 years of reconstruction. The Iranian strategy is to sustain 10 to 20 missile strikes per day indefinitely, depleting defensive stockpiles, keeping civilians in shelters, and making the economic cost of defense higher than the political cost of negotiating a ceasefire. One side is trying to destroy the state's capacity to function. The other side is trying to make defending against attacks more expensive than the attacks themselves. And the insurance market, the oil market, the natural gas market, and the friendly fire incident in Kuwait are all confirming the same conclusion. The defender is losing the economic war even if it is winning individual tactical engagements. So what happens when the cost to insure a tanker is 12% of the vessel's value? What happens when desalination plants that provide 100% of fresh water are within range of missiles that travel at Mach 19 and release 80 submunitions that cannot be intercepted in the atmosphere? What happens when a ground invasion requires using a base that covers 2% of the target country's territory, and the Kurdish leadership refuses to cooperate because cooperation means the destruction of their region? What happens when every assassination is answered within seconds by pre-planned retaliatory strikes because the replacements were already in position and the orders were already signed? The answer is not in any tactical assessment. The answer is in the mathematics of attrition and the economic sustainability of conflicts, where the cost to attack is 1/10 the cost to defend. Share this now, because the gap between the official narrative about destroying Iran's missile capacity and the reality of continuous strikes at hypersonic speeds is not a reporting delay. It is the gap between what was planned and what is actually happening on the ground.